So today I am going to cover or go hit some highlights over chapters 2 and 3. Chapter 2 being all about ethics and social responsibility. Chapter 3 being all about global business. My degree is in my undergrad degree, I should say, is in international business. So I love chapter 3. Both are great chapters, but I just can really get in and talk about chapter 3 all day long. So I'm going to just kind of go over some highlights of both chapter to kind of hone in on some things. I'm going to start with chapter 2. So chapter 2 again is all about ethics and social responsibility. So just know going into it that ethics is a set of moral standards for kind of like what helps us judge whether something is right or wrong. And I always tell people that just because it is legal doesn't mean it is ethical. And the textbook kind of differentiates the difference a little bit. But it also mentions the utilitarianism approach, and that is more just setting our personal ethical standards that really focus on consequences of an action taken by a person or organization. So, and according to this approach, people really should act to generate the greatest good for the greatest number. So if you hear or read about the utilitarianism approach, that's kind of what that refers to. So every human is really entitled to, certain rights such as freedom, pursuit of happiness. Another approach to ethical decision making is just justice, or what is fair according to accepted standards. So that can kind of relate to what's legal and what's not. And so your chapter gets into, how can businesses or organizations really encourage ethical business behavior? Because when we get into toward the end of the book in chapter 16, we will talk about some different financial fallout, some business scandals. A lot of it has to do with unethical practices and kind of coming from the top down within the organization. So kind of really hone in on this. We will revisit it at the end of the semester, but I just kind of think it's interesting to see how it can just unethical behavior can easily trickle down fast, as well as ethical behavior, but you usually only hear about the former. But top management really must shape that ethical culture of organizations. So, we should all lead by example, offer that ethics training, different programs, establish that formal code of ethics, which will look different based on different organizations. Then your chapter 2 kind of goes into what is corporate social responsibility. And that just is really the concern of businesses for the welfare of society. So it consists of different obligations beyond just making a profit. Social responsibility also goes beyond what is required by law or union contract. And so companies may engage in illegal or irresponsible behavior, irresponsible but legal behavior, or just legal and responsible behavior. So the difference is the clear majority of organizations act legally and also try to be socially responsible. So when you see organizations donate or sponsor, a charitable event or anything like that, that is, part of their social responsibility, giving back, and typically to a cause that they are passionate about, or whatever that may be. But that is part of kind of doing their part socially, social responsibility, and taking part in that. And then we talk about how do businesses actually meet their social responsibilities to various stakeholders again being individuals or groups whom the business has responsibilities. So businesses are responsible to employees. They really should provide, that clean, safe working environment. And organizations can really build employees' self-worth through different types of empowering programs. So, as businesses have a responsibility to customers, as we all know, really to kind of, be to the public, if you will, to be like good corporate citizens. So again, going back to that social responsibility and trying to give back to communities. There's different businesses just here locally in Arkansas, specifically Central Arkansas, where like Tacos for Life, for every meal you buy, something is donated. There's other different types. If you go to Tom's Shoes, for every pair of shoes you buy, they donate. So there's a lot of businesses that do those types of things. Again, there's businesses that you will see on charitable events, maybe being sponsors, or whatever that looks like. So a lot of volunteer efforts, cash donations, all of that can be considered part of, one's social or organization's social responsibility. And the chapter ends kind of on different ethical or trends in ethics and social responsibility, talking about how like today our corporate philanthropy is really shifting away from just simply giving to needy groups and is really focused on strategic giving instead, in which that philanthropy relates more closely to the corporate mission or goals and really targets donations to areas where the firm operates. So it also benefits the company as well, as you can kind of see that correlation there. And then it talks about how corporate philanthropy is really coming under increasing attacks from special interest groups. And another trend toward a new social contract between the employer and the employee. So instead of employers having, sole responsibility for maintaining jobs, now the employee must assume part of that burden and find ways to add value to the organization. And, there's a lot of companies that will, allow also their employees time off. I know that the company my husband works for, he's allowed so many hours to go and give back in the community, volunteer, or whatever that looks like. So a lot of companies are getting on board with, that type of giving back to just allowing their employees to kind of get in that community and give back. So that's kind of in the gist of what chapter 2 is about. Chapter 3, again, about doing business globally. And so it kind of starts by talking about different countries and companies that, were once never considered major players in the markets are really now contributing in this dramatic growth in world trade. And a lot of this is due to the technology we have these days. More and more countries really now rely on global trade to really bolster their economies, raise the standard of living, providing jobs, and just really in general improving that quality of life. All right. So, and there's different reasons why. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why we trade globally. Most countries cannot produce enough effectively to provide, what everybody needs. So, but there's a lot of barriers, and we'll kind of get into that. Countries are definitely faced with different barriers. Governments and global organizations really encourage and support international trade. You'll read about the WTO, or the World Trade Organization, in this chapter, and they really have emerged as the world's most powerful institution for reducing our trade barriers and opening different markets. And so it talks about how in this chapter, in chapter 3, it talks about there's 2 international financial organizations that are really instrumental in fostering our global trade. It is the World Bank, and this offers low interest loans to developing nations. And it is also the International Monetary Fund, also known as the MIF. So if you see it, I'm sorry, I said MIF, IMF. So if you see that, that is what that stands for. And it makes short-term loans to member nations that are unable to really meet those budgetary expenses. And so if you, when you start reading in chapter 3, it talks about why global trade is important to the United States and how it's measured. International trade it's necessary, and it really improves our relations with, our friends and allies, it really eases tension among nations. It really, again, as I mentioned, helps bolster those economies and raise our standard of living and improve our quality of life. And so it, in your textbook, it talks about the value of international trade and how it's over like 16 trillion, and it's much more than that now, a year, if you will. And it just continues to grow. And the U.S. plays a major role in the growth in world trade. We have over 100 Fortune 500 companies making over 50% of their profits outside of the United States, which is huge. It also talks about some trade-dependent jobs and how they've really grown at a rate 3 times the growth of U.S.-dependent jobs. And so every U.S. state has realized a growth of jobs really attribute to that trade. And so really trade influences both service and manufacturing jobs. So kind of something to think about. And so it talks about one of the major concepts that we use to measure our global trade is includes the balance of trade. So the difference in the value between a country's exports and then what it imports. It's like, so over a period of time. So export being the products that we send to other countries from the United States, imports being the products, materials, etc., that we bring in from other countries. So exporting, again, products we're sending out, imports, products that we are bringing in. And even though that we try to really increase our exports, we still import quite a bit more than we actually export. Another concept that we use to measure our global trade is our balance of payments. So this is the difference between a country's total payments to other countries and its total receipts from other countries. So that we actually measure global trade. So it mentions in your textbook that like since 1970, both the balance of payments and the balance of trade have been unfavorable, at least to us in the United States. And then a third concept, if you will, of measuring global trade is the exchange rate, in which it's the price of the country's currency in terms of another country's currency. So if a country's currency appreciates, and so it's less of that of a country's currency is needed to buy another country's currency. And so in your book, it kind of goes in depth a little bit more about this. But if a country's currency depreciates, more of that currency will be needed to buy another country's currency. So like if you are traveling internationally and in your assignment you're going to be doing, I have something in here that's related, but you always want to look at the exchange rate and like how it is. So example, if you're traveling to Europe, they use a lot of, not every country in Europe, but a lot of the countries in Europe use the euro. You'll just look up the dollar, the exchange rate between the dollar and the euro. Usually it is, a little bit more than $1 equals a euro. Therefore, you'll be spending a little bit more in Europe. You'll be spending more US dollars, if you will, in the exchange rate than you would in actual euros. So things tend to be a little bit more expensive. And it really depends on the exchange rate. The exchange rate fluctuates, all right? So the dollar to different currencies will fluctuate day to day. So just important if you do travel globally, internationally, whatever, to kind of check the exchange rates for the currency that you will be using. And so in your book kind of gets into why nations trade, all right? Because of the advantages of the experience and the materials different countries have access to, there's lots of reasons why countries trade, all right? Free trade really allows trade among nations without government restrictions. And so the principle of comparative advantage states that each country should specialize in the goods and services it can produce most readily and cheaply, and trade them for those that other countries can actually produce more readily and cheaply. So the result is more goods and services at lower prices than if each country had to produce itself everything it needed. All right. I'll give you an example. I love avocados. All right. I don't know about you all, but I love avocados, and I eat them, and my kids eat them. My husband eats them all year long. And we live in Arkansas, which does not have the climate to grow avocados regularly. So most of our avocados are imported from Mexico and California, where the climates are warmer and they can grow them all year long. If we only could grow avocados in Arkansas or in the United States in general, that we would have a shortage of avocados and they would be way more expensive than they already are. And avocados aren't the cheapest thing to buy anyways when it comes to produce. So just kind of keep that in mind. So that is, why we trade. So then it talks about some different barriers to international trade. There's three major ones. Distance, language, right? That's a big one. Distance and different languages. Tariff barriers, which we'll get into tariffs, and then taxes on imported goods, right? And non-tariff barriers. So non-tariff barriers to trade include import quotas, embargoes, binational regulations, customs regulations, and exchange controls. And the main argument against tariffs is that they discourage free trade and really keep the principle of comparative advantage from working efficiently. And the main argument for using tariffs is that they protect our domestic companies, industries and workers. So we're not just bringing in everything, and the local companies or domestic companies, aren't being shut down because people are importing everything for a cheaper price. So that is some different barriers to trade and why those tariffs are there. And then your book kind of gets into how do governments and institutions really foster world trade. Again, the World Trade Organization, the WTO, created by the Uruguay Round, has emerged as the world's most powerful institution, as I mentioned earlier, for lowering trade barriers and opening more markets worldwide. So the advantage of being a member of the World Trade Organization, or the WTO, is that member countries, or being a member of the WTO, will lower your trade barriers among the different countries that are actually members. And the two international financial organizations, again, as I mentioned, we've got the World Bank and that International Monetary Fund that helps regulate that, if you will. So there are different international economic communities. So it mentions in your book that international economic communities are a bilateral trade agreement between two or more countries or member countries to really lower trade barriers. And so typically they often establish different common tariffs and other trade barriers toward non-member countries. The best economic communities are the European Union, or the EU, as they're known as, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, which is the CAFTA, is the acronym for that. And then that is and the largest, not so new anymore, but newer trade agreement is the Mercosur, and this includes, if I remember right, Peru, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. And so those are some examples of the different agreements that different countries have where they can promote free trade amongst themselves. And then it talks about, your book goes into how do companies really enter the global marketplace. And they do this in different ways. The major methods, including, as I already mentioned, exporting and importing, but licensing and franchising, contract manufacturing, joint ventures, direct foreign investment, and counter trades. And so those are all interesting concepts. A lot by now you probably know what importing and exporting are. And then licensing and franchising, you probably are familiar with. McDonald's is a franchise. So a good example would be if a McDonald's carries Coke products, then that McDonald's has a license to carry Coke products. So that's the difference between franchising and licensing. A franchise is usually, you can buy a franchise. If I want to start my own McDonald's, I could buy a franchise of that. And then if McDonald's wants to sell Coke products, they can buy a license from Coca-Cola in order to be able to do that as well. It talks about different threats and opportunities that exist in the global marketplace. So politics is a big one. And even though politics is always a hot topic, controversial no matter where you go, you will know that in other countries that, politics are much more heated than they are here. If you can imagine that, people are dying quite a bit as far as, based on political thoughts, beliefs, and all the things. So cultural differences is a big one. Economic environments really can represent both opportunities and pitfalls in the global marketplace. So kind of something to think in mind as well. A lot of developing countries really lack economic infrastructure, which makes it often very difficult to conduct business there. So not helping that the case really. And then there's it talks about some advantages of multinational corporations. And they have several advantages. They can typically overcome restrictive trade and regulatory restrictions because they frequently have headquarters in more than one country. And multinationals can also move their operations from one country to the next, really depending on, which location offers a more favorable economic conditions. In addition, multinationals really can tap into a vast source of technological expertise by drawing upon knowledge of a global workforce, if you will. And then the chapter ends in some different trends in the global marketplace. It talks about how global business activity will really just continue to grow and escalate due to several things. Mostly, trends are market expansion, right? All these companies are really wanting to expand. And for a lot of them, the next place is to go global. So that is a big one. Resource acquisition, getting resources from other countries. And then it talks about how different firms desire a larger customer base. Again, another reason to grow globally, or just need additional resources that will continue to seek opportunities outside of our country's borders. All right. And it talks about how China and India are two of our world's powerhouses and are really impacting, businesses around the globe, which we know. I always tell my students, I'm like, hey, everyone, don't have to take your shirt off in class, but look in your shirt or whatever you have on that you can see the tag and tell me where it's from. And, most of it's from China or, Taiwan or Indonesia or somewhere like that. It's hardly ever from the United States. So just a good example of like how we can relate to how we import a lot of things here in the United States. And but I could talk all day about that, and I'm trying to keep these videos fairly short. But that's kind of a wrap on chapters 2 and 3. You will be doing a chapters 2 and 3 assignment, so it will incorporate both of these chapters. The first half of the assignment, you're going to pick a country to start off with. You will pick a country, pick one you're interested in, whichever country that may be. And then the first half of the assignment focuses more on chapter 2, so the ethics, cultural things that relate to the country. There's that part of it. And then the second half of the assignment focuses more on chapter 3, still using that same country, but we're talking about, their imports and their exports, and do they have an absolute advantage of a product or a comparative advantage? We're talking about their exchange rates, how their currency relates to our US dollar. Are they part of any trade organizations? Most countries are. So please do you'll do a little outside research as well as far as looking up some of these things related to your country. But I hope you enjoy it. I always love reading them. It's fun. But that's a wrap on chapters 2 and 3. And I will be chatting with you all soon.